Margaret adjusted her scarf as she stepped out of her small brick house. The autumn air carried a crispness, the kind that hinted at winter waiting just around the corner. Her grandson, Daniel, stood by the silver sedan parked in the driveway. He waved as she approached, his smile polite but a little too careful, as if he were guarding something inside himself. "Thanks for coming with me." "Grandma," he said, opening the passenger door for her. She smiled warmly, resting a hand on his shoulder before sliding into the seat. He was 24 now, tall and quiet, a man in the eyes of the world, but still her grandson in every way that mattered. She had seen him grow from a curious little boy who collected rocks in the yard to a thoughtful young man who often carried silence like a shield. The car engine hummed as Daniel pulled out of the driveway. They drove past familiar houses, past the old bakery where Margaret used to buy him muffins, past the park where he had once chased kites in the wind. Time moved quickly, but in that car, the past seemed to breathe alongside the present. Margaret studied him from the corner of her eye. His grip on the steering wheel was tighter than usual, his shoulders rigid. She could tell his mind was heavy with thoughts. He wasn't the kind to ask her to go on a long drive without reason. She suspected there was something he wanted to say but hadn't yet found the courage for. The road opened before them, long and winding, fields stretching golden under the afternoon sun. The city faded into the distance, replaced by quiet country lanes. The air inside the car carried the faint scent of the pine tree air freshener Daniel had clipped to the vent. It was peaceful, but beneath that peace lingered tension like a string pulled tight. Waiting to be released, Margaret let her gaze wander to the horizon. She remembered her own youth decades earlier, when she had sat in cars with people she cared about, waiting for words that sometimes never came. She remembered how her heart had pounded, how the silence had felt louder than any storm. Now, as she sat beside Daniel, she wondered if he was feeling the same thing she once had, the ache of holding something inside. Daniel cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the road. "I thought we could drive out to the countryside today," he said. His voice was casual, but Margaret heard the hesitation beneath it. "That sounds lovely," she replied, her voice calm, giving him space. They passed by stretches of farmland where leaves had begun to turn shades of amber and crimson. Margaret watched children playing in a yard, their laughter floating faintly through the open window. She thought of Daniel as a boy, his small hand clutching hers, his questions endless, his laughter quick. Now he sat beside her, no longer a child, but a man with secrets resting in his chest. For a while, they filled the silence with small talk. Daniel asked about her garden, and she told him about the chrysanthemums blooming near her porch. She asked about his work at the design firm, and he gave her short, careful answers. His words carried little weight, but his silence carried too much. Margaret had lived long enough to recognize when someone was circling around what they truly wanted to say. It was in the way Daniel glanced at her quickly, then back to the road. It was in the way he tapped his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, as if his nerves needed somewhere to escape. She didn't press him. She knew confessions had to bloom in their own time, not be forced. The countryside deepened, the world quieter now except for the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through open windows. Margaret leaned back in her seat, letting the sunlight warm her face. Her heart carried both curiosity and patience. She remembered her late husband, Robert, and the way he once struggled to tell her he loved her for the first time. He had taken her on a drive just like this, fumbling for words, the silence stretching long until it finally broke with honesty. That memory stirred gently inside her, reminding her how hard it could be to speak when the heart was involved. Turning her gaze back to Daniel, she noticed the set of his jaw, the way his lips pressed into a thin line. He was young, but he carried something deeper than youth's usual restlessness. There was longing there, maybe fear, maybe hope. Margaret felt a pang in her chest, sensing how much this mattered to him. As the car curved along the empty road, Daniel's voice broke the silence again. "Grandma," he said softly, then stopped. The word hung in the air, fragile and unfinished. Margaret didn't push him. She simply turned her head and gave him a gentle smile. the kind that had always told him she was listening. The drive continued, each mile pulling them further from the noise of the city and deeper into quiet fields. The world around them was calm, but inside the car, Margaret knew something important was brewing. Daniel's silence wasn't empty, was full, heavy, waiting for release. She reached down and smoothed the folds of her skirt, trying to steady her own heart. Though she didn't know yet what he was holding back, she could feel the weight of it. And she also knew that sometimes the most important stories weren't told with fanfare or in crowded rooms, they slipped out quietly. In moments just like this. Daniel glanced at her again, then back at the road. His lips parted slightly, as if words hovered at the edge of his tongue. Margaret felt her breath catch, not from fear, but from the sense that she was about to be entrusted with something precious. The countryside stretched on, its golden fields glowing under the lowering sun. The road seemed endless, a ribbon unraveling into the horizon. And within that quiet journey, Margaret understood one thing clearly. This was no ordinary drive. It was a passage, a crossing from silence into confession. She didn't yet know what her grandson was holding in his heart, but she knew the moment he finally spoke would change the rhythm of both their lives. And as the car moved forward, the silence grew thick with anticipation, like the final pause before music begins. The road stretched endlessly, winding through fields where the leaves had begun their quiet transformation into autumn's bright colors. Daniel drove steadily, his eyes fixed on the lines of the highway. Though Margaret could sense that his thoughts were far from the road, he had always been careful, deliberate. But today there was a heaviness to him, a kind of quiet storm that sat just behind his silence. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap. She had learned long ago that silence could reveal more than words ever could. And in Daniel's silence, shared the struggle of someone who wanted to speak but feared. What might happen after? They talked at first about simple things. Daniel asked about her baking, if she had made her apple pie again for the neighbors. She told him she had, and he nodded, smiling faintly, though his eyes didn't carry the ease that smile suggested. He mentioned his work, how deadlines had been piling up. Margaret listened, nodding, but she could tell those words were placeholders. His voice lacked the weight of someone truly speaking his mind as the car moved deeper into the countryside. The conversations dwindled. Daniel's fingers tapped the steering wheel, restless, while his other hand clenched and unclenched against his leg. Margaret glanced at him, her grandmother's intuition tugging at her. She had seen that nervous rhythm before years ago in her own mirror, when she herself had held back words too tender to speak. Finally, Daniel broke the silence, his voice softer than the hum of the engine. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" Margaret turned her head gently toward him. "Of course, dear. You can ask me anything." He hesitated, his jaw tightening, his eyes still locked on the road. Do you ever regret the choices you made when you were younger?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She had expected something about work, maybe his future, perhaps even about his parents. But regret, that was a word heavy with history, with shadows of paths not taken. Her breath stilled for a moment. She was not a woman who often looked backward, but the question forced her heart into old corners. She thought of the letters she had never sent, the love she had once been too afraid to chase, the dreams she had folded away when life demanded steadiness instead of risk. "Yes," she said softly, though her voice carried steadiness. "I do. Everyone has regrets. Choices left behind. Words never spoken. That's part of being human." Daniel glanced at her quickly, then back to the road. His throat moved as though he were swallowing down more words. Margaret watched him closely, sensing his question was not just curiosity, but a mirror of his own struggle. "Why do you ask, Daniel?" She pressed gently. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the wheel. "Because sometimes I feel like I'm standing in front of a choice, and I'm afraid of making the wrong one." The car grew quiet again. The countryside passed by rows of trees glowing in the sunlight. Barns standing in fields, fences running along the road like old lines of memory. But inside the car, the silence carried weight, heavy and unshakable. Margaret leaned back against the seat, her mind swirling with both worry and tenderness. She thought of how Daniel had always carried his heart quietly, never rushing, never careless. He was like her in that way deep waters beneath a calm surface. But deep waters could drown a person if they stayed still too long. "Daniel," she said softly, "fear can be a terrible companion. It whispers all the things that could go wrong, but it never tells us what might go right." He smiled faintly at her words, but said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his silence trembling like a door he wasn't ready to open. Margaret didn't push further. She knew confessions couldn't be dragged out, they had to bloom on their own. She simply rested her hand on the armrest between them, a quiet reminder that she was there. The drive carried them past an old wooden bridge, the sound of the tires echoing across the planks. Daniel slowed the car slightly, his voice finally breaking again. "There's something I want to tell you," he admitted. His voice was strained, the words pulled out of him as if they carried a weight too heavy to keep inside much longer. "But I don't know how." Margaret turned her head fully to him now, her heart beating faster. She saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders tensed, as though he were carrying a secret that had been pressing against him for far too long. "You don't have to have the perfect words," she said gently. "You only have to be honest." Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. I don't want you to look at me differently. I don't want to disappoint you." Her chest ached at those words. This boy, this man, who had been her pride since the day he was born, how could he believe he could ever disappoint her? She longed to tell him right then that nothing he could confess would ever change her love for him. But she held her tongue. Sometimes people needed to carry their truth out on their own, without interruption. The silence between them deepened once more. But it wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of anticipation, of a heart trembling at the edge of being revealed. Margaret could almost hear his heartbeat in the quiet hum of the car. She turned her gaze to the passing fields, letting the colors of autumn steady her own heart. She remembered her youth again, the moments she had swallowed her words, the moments she had chosen safety over honesty. She remembered the years of wondering, what if? She thought of the letter she had once written to Robert before they were married, a letter she never had the courage to send. Regret? Yes, she knew regret well. She placed her hand gently on Daniel's arm, her voice calm but firm. "Daniel, if your heart is full, you must let it speak. Holding it in only makes the silence louder." He looked at her briefly, his eyes shining with something unspoken, then turned back to the road. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. The car moved on, carrying them further from the city and deeper into the quiet countryside. The moment of truth was coming. Margaret could feel it pressing close, like the final pause before a storm breaks. But for now, Daniel still sat in hesitation, caught between the safety of silence and the danger of confession. And Margaret, though her heart ached with waiting, knew one thing for certain: the next words out of his mouth would change everything. The car slowed as Daniel turned off the main road. The city was long behind them now, and the countryside stretched out wide, dotted with trees glowing with autumn fire. He drove down a narrow lane lined with tall maples, their branches arching above like a tunnel of color. The air grew quieter, the kind of stillness that seemed to wait for truth to be spoken. Margaret felt her grandson's energy shift. His silence no longer seemed like hesitation, but like a buildup, a wave about to crest. She watched him grip the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. She knew that whatever he was carrying had been sitting in his heart for far too long. At last, Daniel pulled the car onto a gravel path and slowed to a stop under the shade of the trees. The engine hummed softly, but he didn't move to turn it off. His chest rose and fell quickly, and Margaret could almost hear the rhythm of his nervous breathing. "Daniel," she said gently, "you don't have to be afraid with me." He kept his eyes on the wheel, his voice low. "I know, but I've been holding this in for so long. I don't even know how to start." Margaret reached over, placing her hand on his arm. Her touch was steady, warm, the kind of comfort only a grandmother could give. Start from the heart. It doesn't have to be perfect. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a long breath. When he finally spoke, his words tumbled out, soft and trembling. There's someone I care about, more than I've ever cared about anyone before. I think about them every day. I can't stop. But I don't know what to do. I don't know if it's right, or if I'll ruin everything if I say it aloud. Margaret's chest tightened as she listened. His voice carried both fear and longing, the kind she remembered all too well from her own youth. It was the sound of a heart weighed down by unspoken love. "Who is it?" she asked softly, though she didn't expect him to say the name. What mattered wasn't the name, it was the truth. He was finally allowing himself to release. Daniel shook his head, staring at the wheel. "I can't tell you that yet. Not because I don't trust you, but because I'm afraid once I say it, it'll be real. And I don't know if I'm strong enough for that yet." Margaret's eyes softened. She saw the boy she had once rocked to sleep, the child who used to run into her arms after school. Now sitting before her as a man struggling with the same fears she once knew. Love, she thought, always carried this mixture of hope and terror. "Daniel," she said gently, "you're not weak for being afraid, but you are stronger than you think. Love is never simple. It makes us vulnerable. But silence can break the heart more deeply than rejection ever could." Daniel turned to her then, his eyes wet with unshed tears. For a moment he looked younger, as though the weight of his feelings had made him fragile again. "I thought you might be disappointed in me," he whispered. "That maybe you'd think I was foolish for feeling this way." Margaret's heart ached. She reached for his hand, wrapping her fingers over his trembling ones. "Oh, my dear boy," she said softly, "love is never foolish. It is the most human thing we have. What would disappoint me is if you let fear steal this from you." He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. For the first time, his shoulders relaxed slightly, as if her words had loosened a chain around him. He let out a shaky laugh, though his voice cracked in the sound. "I don't even know what they'd say if I told them. Maybe they don't feel the same. Maybe I'll lose them." Margaret shook her head gently. "Maybe, but what if they've been waiting for you to speak? What if they're carrying the same weight in their heart right now? You'll never know if you hide behind silence." Daniel stared ahead, his lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. His eyes darted to the window, watching the light flicker through the trees. Margaret stayed quiet, letting him breathe, letting him hold space for his truth. The engine continued its low hum. A breeze stirred the leaves outside, and a few golden ones floated down across the windshield. Inside the car, time felt suspended, as though the world had paused to listen. Finally, Daniel turned to her again, his voice raw. "Grandma, it feels like my whole heart is wrapped up in this. If I say it and I lose them, I don't know what I'll have left." Margaret's chest ached at his words, so filled with the trembling courage of youth. She thought of the man she had once loved before Robert, the one she had never confessed her feelings to. For years afterward, she had wondered what could have been. The regret had lingered, a shadow she carried quietly. She leaned closer, her voice soft but steady. "Then you must tell them, Daniel, because regret will stay with you forever. It will whisper, 'What if?' until your last day. Don't let fear write your story." For a moment, Daniel's face broke, his expression caught between relief and pain. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he let out another long breath. "You really think I should?" Margaret nodded, squeezing his hand firmly. "I don't just think it, I know it. Love is worth the risk. Always." He closed his eyes, as if trying to hold on to her words, to let them sink into the deepest parts of him. When he opened them again, there was still uncertainty. But there was also a new light, a flicker of hope. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of two souls sitting together in truth. Margaret could feel it, the shift that had taken place. He had not yet spoken the name, but he had spoken his heart. And that was the first step. The car remained parked beneath the canopy of trees, the sunlight flickering in gentle patterns across the windshield. Margaret leaned back, her hand still resting over his. Her heart was full not with answers, but with pride. Her grandson had finally let his guard fall. He had confessed not everything, not the name, not the details, but the truth of his heart. And sometimes, Margaret knew, that was the hardest confession of all. She gazed at him, her voice soft, almost like a prayer. "This is only the beginning, Daniel. The rest will come when you're ready." He nodded slowly, his lips curving into the faintest, most fragile smile. And in that moment, Margaret understood that their journey was no longer just about the drive, it was about carrying love forward, no matter how uncertain the road ahead might be. The car sat quietly under the shade of the tall maples, the golden leaves whispering against the windows. Daniel kept his hands on the wheel, though the car wasn't moving. His shoulders were less tense than before, but Margaret could still sense the weight in him. She waited, giving him the silence he needed. Some truths only came out when the listener had the patience to stay still. Finally, Daniel's voice broke the quiet. It was barely above a whisper. "I thought you'd be disappointed in me, Grandma. I've carried this for so long, and I was scared of what you'd think if you knew." Margaret turned toward him, her heart aching at the tremble in his words. She saw the boy he used to be, the child who used to run into her kitchen with scraped knees, the teenager who struggled to find his place in the world. And now the man sitting before her with a heart so heavy he could hardly hold it inside. She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "Disappointed," she said gently. "Daniel, I could never be disappointed in you for loving someone. Love is not a failure. Love is the most human thing we have. What disappoints me is when people let fear keep them from living fully." Her words seemed to reach him, cutting through the wall of doubt he had built. His eyes glistened, and for the first time that day he let a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though he had been waiting for someone to finally tell him it was all right to feel as deeply as he did. "I don't even know how to say it to them," Daniel admitted, his voice unsteady. "What if I tell them and it changes everything? What if they don't feel the same? I could lose them completely." Margaret's heart softened. She thought of her own past, the people she had once loved, the words she had left unsaid because of fear. Regret was a wound that healed poorly, always aching when you least expected it. She didn't want her grandson to carry that same pain. "Maybe you will lose them," she said honestly, her tone calm and steady. "But maybe you won't. Maybe they've been waiting for you to speak all this time. And if you never say it, you'll never know. Silence can protect you, Daniel, but it can also trap you. Don't live a life where your heart stays locked away." He exhaled deeply, leaning back in his seat. For a long moment, he simply stared out at the trees, watching as more leaves drifted to the ground. His chest rose and fell in slow, heavy breaths. Margaret stayed quiet, letting him gather himself. After a while, he spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "You're right. I can't keep hiding it. Even if I'm scared, even if I lose them. At least I'll know I was brave enough to try." Margaret smiled softly, pride filling her chest. "That's all I've ever wanted for you. To live with courage, to love without regret." For the first time since the drive began, Daniel laughed quietly, though it was shaky and fragile. "You always know what to say." She patted his hand, her eyes warm. "I only know because I've lived long enough to learn the cost of silence. I don't want you to pay it too." The air between them felt lighter, though the moment still carried weight. Daniel seemed younger somehow, as though finally letting part of his truth slip free had lifted years off his shoulders. His smile, though small, was genuine. They sat there for a few minutes longer, listening to the quiet of the countryside. Then Daniel turned the key and the car rolled forward again, the gravel crunching under the tires. The road stretched ahead, lined with gold and crimson trees glowing under the afternoon sun. As they drove, Margaret leaned back in her seat, feeling the rhythm of the wheels against the road. Her heart was full of memories, of pride, of hope for the young man beside her. She didn't know who it was that held Daniel's heart, but she didn't need to. What mattered was that he had finally spoken his truth, and that truth would carry him forward. Daniel's voice broke the silence once more, but this time it carried a gentler tone. "Grandma?" Thank you. For listening. For not judging me. I didn't realize how badly I needed to say it out loud. Margaret turned to him with a soft smile. Sometimes, Daniel, saying it is the bravest step of all. The rest will come when you're ready. The countryside passed in a blur. Barns and fields and fences flashing by. But inside the car, something had shifted forever. Margaret knew her grandson would carry her words with him. And she knew no matter what happened next, he would never again face his feelings alone. The sky grew softer as the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and pink. Daniel reached over and turned on the radio, a quiet song filling the car. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was just enough to hold the moment in gentle sound. Margaret rested her head lightly against the window, her thoughts calm. She remembered all the times she had longed to say more to the people she loved, the moments she had let slip away. But now, watching Daniel, she felt at peace. Perhaps it wasn't too late, after all, not for her, not for him. They reached the edge of town just as twilight began to settle. Streetlights flickered on one by one as the car rolled back toward familiar streets. Margaret felt the day's weight settle into her bones. But it wasn't heavy, it was the weight of something meaningful, something that would stay with her. As Daniel pulled into her driveway, he turned to her with a small smile. His eyes were clearer now, less burdened, as though speaking had opened a new door inside him. "I think I'm going to do it, Grandma," he said. "I think I'm going to tell them." Margaret reached over, cupping his cheek gently. "That's my brave boy. Whatever happens, know, you will never be alone. My love for you will always be stronger than fear." Daniel's eyes shone, and he leaned forward, pressing his forehead lightly against hers for just a moment. No words were needed. When he finally pulled back, the car was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of understanding, of love that spanned generations, of courage that had finally found its voice. As Margaret stepped out of the car and watched her grandson drive away, she whispered to herself, "Yes, this is only the beginning." And in her heart, she knew whatever awaited him, his story of love was about to unfold.